Hey, hey, Soo-Hi AP Biology dudes and dudettes. This is Mr. McLeod again. Welcome to our next summer assignment podcast on behavior biology, chapter 51 in our textbook. Today, we will begin our introduction to the behavior of living organisms and the research that allows us to understand these behaviors, maybe even our own. So get your notebook out, something to write with, and let's behave. Okay, so here's an outline of what we will cover in this segment. Look it over, and if you feel it's necessary, copy it down in your notes so you can follow along. So we're going to look at what behavior is. We're going to learn about innate behavior and learned behavior, and then some current areas of research on those kinds of areas of behavior. So let's move on. Okay, first of all, let's ask a question. What is behavior? Behavior is what an animal does and how it does it. Write that down. These behaviors can be muscular, like being seen or heard like these wolves in this picture, or it can be non-muscular, like the secretion of sex attractants such as pheromones. Also write that in your notes. Now we're also learning that genes can influence behavior and can evolve a new behavior over time. This has spawned a new science called behavioral ecology. Now what this is trying to understand behavior in the evolutionary sense. This was developed by Charles Darwin. So write that down. Okay, now there are two main causes of behavior. The first is proximate cause, P-R-O-X-I-M-A-T-E, proximate cause, where mechanistic environmental stimuli trigger behavior, like the amount of sunlight during the year triggers leaves to start forming on the trees. So write that down. And then the second cause is called ultimate cause, which is why or how behavior improves fitness, such as an increase in breeding success. Write that down as well. Now, there are many, many case studies that have shown that both genes and the environment influence behavior. So it's a combination of both. That's a really important concept to get down. Here's a great example of how behavior can evolve. Look at the behavior of the Fisher's lovebird. The Fisher's lovebird has nests made with long strips. You can see the Fisher's longbird tearing this long strip off, and there is no tucking behavior. Now, if you see the peach-faced lovebird in the second diagram, this is the tucking behavior we're talking about. So in the peach-faced lovebird, sorry, that's hard to say, nests are made with short strips. You can see much shorter strips, and there are tucking behaviors. Now let's move on to the hybrid. The hybrid now would be a cross between the Fisher's lovebird and the peach-faced lovebird. Now, so the hybrid nests are made with intermediate length strips, not long, not short, but intermediate length in their first mating season. And any tucking behavior like you see here would be unsuccessful. In other words, it would not attract a mate. However, in later seasons, you get now a head turning behavior that works. So we've gone from two separate species, Fisher's and the peach-faced lovebird, both doing their own thing, to a hybrid species now that is exhibiting the behaviors of both. That's an evolution that happens over time. Now let's talk about innate behavior. Innate behavior is defined as behavior that is pre-programmed into the animal, meaning that all individuals exhibit the behavior despite environmental differences, and that these behaviors are developmentally fixed. Get that in your notes. Now, some examples would be baby birds born blind, like you see here in this picture, and a human infant's ability to suckle or breastfeed that you see here on the right. In fact, the science of ethology, E-T-H-O-L-O-G-Y, is the study of how animals behave in their natural habitat. So get that in your notes as well. Our next behavior is called foraging. Foraging is the behavior organisms exhibit when they are searching for food and why they choose the food they do. So get that in your notes. So that's when they're searching for their food and why they choose the food they do. Now, most often this is a cost-benefit relationship, a balance between the energy it takes to find the food versus the amount of energy they actually get from the food. So get that in your notes now. Now, a couple of examples. This cardinal must decide whether it's worth flying a distance to get the frozen dogwood berries you see him eating here. Same thing with the grizzly bears in the pictures on the right. Now, optimal foraging, so get this down, optimal foraging is the compromise between feeding cost and feeding benefit. So get that in your notes. Optimal foraging, the compromise between feeding cost and feeding benefit. Here are three of the pioneers, the men who founded the animal behavior sciences. So get their names in your notes. You never know when this might pop up on an AP test. So grab these three names, put them in your notes, tuck them away, and then we'll talk about them later in class. Okay, now let's look at fixed action patterns. Fixed action patterns are the sequence of behaviors essentially unchangeable and usually conducted to completion once it starts. So a sequence of behaviors essentially unchangeable and usually conducted to completion once it starts. So get that in your notes. We're talking about fixed action patterns. Now, this action pattern normally requires a sign stimulus, which is defined as a releaser that triggers the fixed action pattern. So get sign stimulus in your notes. It's the releaser that triggers the fixed action pattern. So let's look at the example in this picture of the sticklebacks. Now, the behavior we're looking at here is that the male attacks other males that invade its nesting territory. Now, what causes that behavior? Well, we have two causes here. The proximate cause, think of it as a physical cause, is that the red belly of the intruding male acts as a sign stimulus and results in the release of aggression in the male protecting the nest. Get that down. However, the ultimate cause of the behavior is that a male decreases the chance that eggs laid in his nesting territory will be fertilized by another male. So get that in your notes. Now, another fixed action pattern is the male and female spawning ritual you see here on the right. You can see all kinds of proximate or physical cues that stimulate the actions of both the male and the female. Ultimately, though, it's the passing on of the genes and the production of a new generation of sticklebacks that's the ultimate goal here. So again, let's differentiate between proximate goal or physical cue and then the ultimate goal. Okay, now let's move on from innate or inborn behavior to learned behavior. Learned behavior is innate behavior that improves with repetitive performance. Get that in your notes. Now, the thing about learned behavior is that when mistakes are made, modifications result from that experience. Now, you see a dog up here shaking with its owner. So that took some time for that dog to figure out that's what the owner wanted. Now, what drove the dog was pleasing the owner. But the owner had to teach the dog exactly what behavior the owner wanted. So there were modifications made. And those modifications result from those experiences. We call that improvement. And when that happens, voila, shake, Snoopy, shake. All right, next is imprinting, which is learning at a specific critical time and forms social attachments to another. It involves both learning and innate components. Get that in your notes. So we're talking about imprinting now. Now you can see an example of this here in this diagram. On the left-hand side, you see these goslings, these geese following a human, where on the right you see them following another goose. But how do the young know on whom or what to imprint? How do young geese know that they should follow the mother goose? Now the tendency to respond is innate in the birds. The outside world provides the imprinting stimulus, something to which the response will be directed. Now experiments with many species of waterfowl indicate that they have no innate recognition of, quote, mother. They respond to and identify with the very first object they encounter that has certain key characteristics. Write that down. Now, in classic experiments done in the 30s, Konrad Lorenz showed that the most important imprinting stimulus in gray-lag geese is movement of an object away from the young. When incubator-hatched goslings spent their first few hours with Lorenz, rather than with a goose, they imprinted on him, and from then on, they steadfastly followed him and showed no recognition of their biological mother or other adults of their own species. Again, there are both proximate and ultimate explanations. So make sure you understand what imprinting is and why it happens. Okay, now on to habituation. You see the word here, habituation. Habituation is the loss of response to stimulus, otherwise known as the cry-wolf effect. Get that in your notes. What this means is that organisms learn not to respond to repeated occurrences of a stimulus. Get that in your notes as well. Now let's outline an example. A turtle draws its head back into its shell when its shell is touched. After being touched repeatedly, the turtle realizes it's not in danger and no longer hides. Another example of habituation would be when you put on a pair of shorts for the first time over the summer. The sensation of air on your legs feels very different. However, once you've worn them for a while, you become used to the sensation and stop noticing it. That's another example of habituation. Okay, next is associative learning, which is learning to associate one feature of the environment that we call a stimulus with another. Get that in your notes. So associating one feature of the environment with another. Now, there are two kinds of associative learning. The first is classical conditioning. Classical conditioning is where there is stimulus and a reward, and then punishment like Pavlov's dog. So get that down. And then there's operant conditioning, when there's a trial and error, like a mouse that learns to press a lever for food. Also write that down. Let's talk about Pavlov's experience very briefly. Ivan Pavlov exposed dogs to a bell ringing and at the same time sprayed their mouths with powdered meat, causing them to salivate. Soon the dogs would salivate after hearing the bell, but not getting any powdered meat. That's the classic Pavlov's dog experiment. So make sure you kind of have that in your memory banks for whenever you're asked about associative learning. Okay, now let's take a look at directed movements. There are two main types of directed movements. The first is called kinesis. You see the word here in this picture. Kinesis is the simple change in activity or turning rate in response to a stimulus. Get that down in your notes. Now we can see here that the sow bugs become more active in dry areas and less active in humid areas. Though sow bugs do not move toward or away from specific conditions, their increased movement under dry conditions increases the chance that they will leave a dry area and encounter a moist one. And since they slow down in the moist area, they tend to stay there once they encounter it. Now we're going to do an experiment with sow bugs, so it's important that you put this example in your notes. Then there is taxis, which is a more or less automatic movement towards or away from a stimulus. Write that down. Now when that movement is towards a stimulus, we call it positive taxis. And when it's away from the stimulus, we call it negative taxis. Also write that down. Now in contrast to a kinesis, a taxis is more or less automatic, oriented movement toward or away from a stimulus. For example, many stream fish, such as trout, exhibit positive taxis when they automatically swim or orient themselves in an upstream direction toward the current. Now this taxis keeps the fish from being swept away and keeps them facing in the direction from which the food will come. Now in directed movements, organisms often use landmarks within a familiar area. Some organisms move in response to a recognized object or environmental cue where the object is the landmark. Some actually use what we call cognitive maps, which are internal codes of spatial relationships of objects in the environment. Get those down. And then let's look at 4 examples. So you're going to get these 4 behaviors down in your notes. The first is migration. Migration is the regular movement of animals over relatively long distances. I just saw a great special on PBS the other day on monarch butterflies. Monarch butterflies migrate from way up in the Arctic region all the way down to Mexico every year. And the way they do it is amazing. We'll talk about it later on in this class. But that's an example of migration. Now the second is called piloting, like piloting an airplane. Now this is where an animal moves from one familiar landmark to another until it reaches its destination. Then there's orientation. Orientation is when animals can detect directions and travel in particular paths until reaching a destination. And then the fourth is called navigation. Navigation is the most complex and involves determining one's present location relative to other locations in addition to detecting compass directions. Cues for these behaviors include the Earth magnetic field, the sun, and the stars. Migration is still a huge mystery to scientists. We have no idea really what cues all of this. We don't know why birds go where they go other than their learned behavior from others. But when you separate them, go to a different part of the country, they end up back where they're supposed to be. So there's a big mystery around this behavior. But scientists believe they're making progress trying to figure out what it is. Competitive social behaviors often represent contests for resources. Strangely, this sometimes results in cooperation. For example, you see the pack of hyenas in this picture working together to bring down this wildebeest. While in the picture below it, we see pelicans all working together to round up bait fish and insects so they can have something to eat. Now let's look a bit closer at these behaviors in more detail. Now, agonistic behavior, agonistic, is a contest involving threats. Write that down. Now, agonistic behavior normally involves some kind of submissive behavior and a ritual or the use of some symbolic activity. Write that down too. Now, in agonistic behavior in general, no harm is done to any of the organisms. Also get that down. Then there's something called reconciliation behavior, which often happens between conflicting individuals. And that varies from species to species. But get that in your notes just so you understand that there's a behavior called reconciliation behavior. Now, then there's dominance hierarchies. Dominance hierarchies involve a ranking of individuals in a group. Get that in your notes. We call it a pecking order. Very often they're referred to as alpha or beta rankings. Now, they exist in order to control the behavior of others. Also get that down. Then there's territoriality. That's behavior when an individual defends a particular area called their territory. Get that down in your notes. Now, territories are typically used for feeding, mating, and rearing young and are fixed in location. So get that down in your notes as well.